Welcome back! With all the components that we built in the last lessons, we can construct any type of forms. But what good is a form unless we can send the user's input to be processed or stored in our backend? In the current state of front-end development, the most common approach to submitting form data to our backend is through XML HTTP requests, or XHR for short. We'll talk about this more in a little bit, but for now, just know that Axios is a library that will allow you to create XHR requests without having to deal with the vanilla XHR JavaScript API, which can be a little bit cumbersome. There's some form concepts we have to learn and understand before diving into plugging Axios into our application to start making these XHR requests. Let's dig into the defaults of form behavior and some fundamental accessibility concepts first. The default behavior of a form in HTML is to send a bunch of data into a specified URL by triggering a browser navigation event. What this means is that without the use of a library like Axios, your HTML forms will, by default, make the browser load a completely new page. In the age of single-page applications, where we want to provide a seamless navigation to the user without the constant full reloading of pages, this is not a great experience. The second thing you need to consider about forms is every single form needs a wrapping form tag. Screen readers often switch to forms mode when they are processing content within a form element. This gives users that use accessible technologies a better experience when navigating forms, and there is no reason to ever not do it. The third form consideration you'll need to account for is there are many ways to trigger the submission of a form. A user can click or tap into a submit button and click it or hit enter. A user may also hit the enter key inside one of our fields. Screen readers will look for buttons with the type submit type on them. How then do we correctly capture the user's attempt to submitting our form? Whenever a user submits a form with a wrapping form tag, this form tag emits a submit event that we can listen to. And even though it's common practice to set a click listener to the submit button of a form, this should be avoided. Listening to the click event of a button within the form tag and preventing its default behavior effectively blocks the default behavior of an HTML form, which is to submit the submit event, and afterwards sending the data within said form. However, it does not cover us from other possible ways of submitting said form, such as the ones we have learned about earlier. Let's now open up VS Code into our simpleform.view component. As you can see, we already have our submit button set up with the type of submit. Whenever a button with the type of submit that lives within a wrapping form element is clicked, it fires off that wrapping form's submit event. This is the behavior that we want for our forms. You might be wondering, what happens if we forget to add this type of submit to one of our buttons inside the form? Browsers will assume that any buttons within form tags that do not have a set type are meant to submit this form. However, the extra specificity will help accessibility tools to identify it as the button meant to be used to submit our form. If our form required other types of buttons, such as a cancel button, for example, adding the specific type button to it will effectively stop it from triggering the form submit event. We can now go to our form tag and start listening to the submit event of our form. Let's now scroll up to our form element. We will add a submit listener with a prevent modifier. This will trigger a sendForm method that we will create in a minute. Notice that we are using the event modifier .prevent on the submit event listener. This modifier will call prevent default on the submit event for us, so that our sendForm method can focus exclusively on the logic of submitting our form and not on event handling. Setting prevent default on a submit event for a form element will block the default behavior of having the form submit the data by itself and reloading the browser. We want to keep control on how our form is being processed, and we want to post our data using Axios. So preventing this default behavior is exactly what we need. Now that we are listening to our event, let's go ahead and add our new sendForm method inside the methods block in the script section of our simpleForm.view component. We will leave a comment here for now, and we will come back to it. In order to be able to capture our users' input once they submit the form within our new sendForm method, we need to first get ourselves set up with two things. The Axios library we discussed in the beginning of the lesson to be able to make our XHR requests, and an API endpoint where we're going to be able to send our dummy data to. Let's start with getting Axios set up. Head over to your terminal on the project root and run the following command to add Axios to your project with your favorite package manager. Once Axios is done installing, we can head over to the top of the script block in our simpleForm.view component and import the library so that we can make use of it later. Now that we have Axios set up, we need to create an endpoint that will receive our data once the user posts the form. In a real-world scenario, this endpoint will usually be provided by the backend of your application or by a third-party service such as Firebase. For the sake of learning, we are going to be using my JSON server. You can see the URL on your screen now. A free way to create our own fake online endpoint so that we can learn how to post our form. You will already be familiar with this if you've taken our real-world Vue 3 course here on Vue Mastery. Setting up for your own GitHub repos is really easy. Just go ahead and follow the instructions on their website and add a db.json file to the main or master branch of your repo. Then, you can access and use it through the URL structure that they provide as a REST API endpoint. I've already gone ahead and created this for us so that we can use it with the courses repo here on Vue Mastery. The URL for our REST API is shown on screen. When you open the server, you will notice that under Resources, we have events listed. I'm going to click into it. This is our API endpoint for events. I will not go into details of what a REST API is, because that is completely out of the scope of this course. But unless you are a full-stack developer and are going to be creating the REST API on your own, the most important thing that you need to know at this moment is that we can grab this URL and make XHR requests to it. In particular, when saving the data from a form, you will almost always want to make a particular type of request, a POST request, which allows us to send a chunk of data back to the server with it. Let's swing back to the code and take a look at how to achieve sending our forms data to the REST API with Axios. Let's scroll all the way down because we're going to add an Axios call to our sendForm method. We will remove the comment. We will add an Axios.post call. I will now paste in the URL for our endpoint and add this.event as the second parameter. We will go over this in a minute. We will also add a then block with a console log inside of it, and a catch block, also with a console log. Since we already imported Axios, we can access its post method directly from the Axios object. The first argument that it requires is the URL onto where it's going to send the information. In this case, the one provided to us for the events endpoint of our MyJSON server mock API. The second argument is the payload, an object containing all the information we want to send over to our server. Since we already have all of the form's information neatly wrapped into our event data object, we can make use of it directly here and just send it as is to the server. Be warned, in a real-life scenario, you will want to validate your user's input before sending it to the server, even if your backend is going to perform server-side validation. Doing a pre-validation on the front end or the client-side validation is a highly recommended practice. In general, any type of pre-checks or UX changes you want to make while the form is posting should be done here in the sendForm method. Displaying a loading spinner or changing the text of the submit button to sending are a few nice UX tricks you can leverage at this stage. Validations and UX are out of the scope of this lesson though, so we are going to skip them for now and revisit in another course for more advanced form topics. An important thing to know is that Axios methods return JavaScript promises. This means that we can append a then method to our post call that will return the response from the server for us to work with, and a catch method that we can use to handle any errors that may occur when sending the data. For the purposes of this lesson, we are only going to console log the results here to see both of these methods in action. Let's go back to the browser now. Now that our submit function is ready, and after we've learned all of that theory, we are finally ready to go back to the browser and test out our form. Serve your project and fill out the form. I've already done it here in the video. Make sure you have your network tab open in your browser so you can see the requests going out. And finally, hit that submit button to see all the information swiftly sent to our API. In the network tab, we can see our successful request and the response mirroring our payload. And in the console, our log with the full response data. That was a lot of theory, but we now have a fully functional form that submits data to our server. There's one more thing though, arguably one of the most important bits of all. A few lessons ago, I mentioned that our components were not accessible, and while in a real-life scenario accessibility should be a main consideration while developing your components, it simply was too much information to put on top of our previous lessons. We are now ready to circle back and take a look at some basic accessibility concepts that you should always keep in mind when building forms in Vue. See you there!